Hello everyone. Welcome to Realist Quill. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? I never thought I'd be the one to kill my mother twice. The first time was on a Tuesday. The hospice nurse had just left, assuring me that Mom wouldn't last the night. Pancreatic cancer had reduced her once vibrant body to a husk, her skin jaundiced and stretched over prominent bones. I sat beside her bed, holding her papery hand as her breathing grew increasingly labored. Until finally at 2:17 a.m., it stopped altogether. I called the funeral home as instructed. They said they'd send someone within the hour. So I washed her face, combed her thin white hair, and changed her into the outfit she'd selected months ago, when we first received the terminal diagnosis. Simple, dignified. A pale blue dress she'd worn to my college graduation. I sat with her remembering birthdays and Christmases, arguments and reconciliations, all the mundane moments that constitute a relationship, a life. The mortician arrived at 3:30 a.m. He was a short, balding man with kind eyes and efficient movements. He expressed his condolences, had me sign some paperwork, and then wheeled in a gurney to transport Mom's body. "Would you like to say goodbye before we go?" he asked gently. I nodded, leaning down to kiss her forehead one last time. Her skin was cool now, the warmth of life already fading. "Goodbye, Mom," I whispered. "I love you." And that should have been it. The end of a chapter, the beginning of grief and eventual healing. Except 2 days later, as I was sorting through her belongings in preparation for the funeral, I received a call from the funeral director. "Miss Halls," his voice sounded strained. "I'm afraid there's been an incident with your mother's remains." "What kind of incident?" I asked, immediately on edge. He hesitated. "I think it would be best if you came down to discuss this in person." An hour later, I sat across from him in his office, a tastefully decorated room designed to convey reverence and professionalism. The funeral director, Mr. Patterson, folded his hands on his desk and took a deep breath. "What I'm about to tell you is, your mother's body was brought here early Wednesday morning and placed in our cooler facility. Standard procedure for bodies awaiting embalming." I nodded, wondering where this was going. "This morning, when our embalmer went to begin preparations," he paused, visibly uncomfortable. "Ms. Halsey, there was movement from your mother's body." I stared at him blankly. "Movement?" I repeated. "What exactly does that mean?" At first we thought it was simply gas escaping. It happens sometimes. But then, he swallowed hard. She opened her eyes. A chill ran through me. "That's not possible. My mother died. I was there. I understand how this sounds," he said quickly. "The attending physician certified her death, but somehow, she's exhibiting signs of life, minimal, but present." "So she's alive?" My mind reeled, caught between horror and hope. "What, like a coma, or Lazarus syndrome?" He shook his head. "No, Miss Halsey, her heart isn't beating. She has no pulse, no respiration. Medically, she's deceased, but she's moving, making sounds. We've already called the medical examiner, and I want to see her," I said firmly, rising from my chair. Mr. Patterson hesitated. "I'm not sure that's advisable." "She's my mother," I interrupted. "I need to see her." After a moment, he nodded. "Very well, but I need to prepare you. What you're about to see isn't natural." He led me through a door marked staff only, and down a sterile hallway to a room at the far end. A security guard stood outside, which struck me as bizarre. Why would they need security at a funeral home? "We've had to take precautions," Mr. Patterson explained, noting my confusion. "Your mother isn't the only case. There have been reports from other funeral homes across the city." My stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" Instead of answering, he pushed open the door. The preparation room was clinical. Stainless steel surfaces, bright lights, and the sharp scent of chemicals. In the center stood an embalming table, and on it lay my mother. At least, what used to be my mother. Her eyes were open, milky and unseeing, moving erratically in their sockets. Her jaw worked silently, opening and closing as though trying to speak. Her fingers twitched against the sheet draped over her body. But most disturbing was the sound. A low, continuous moan that raised every hair on my arms. "Mom," I whispered, approaching cautiously. Mr. Patterson caught my arm. "Don't get too close. We don't know if it's contagious." I froze. Contagious? What exactly do you think this is? The CDC is calling it Lazarus strain for now. It appears to be some kind of prion disease that activates post-mortem. It doesn't restore life, but it stimulates basic neural functions, movement. Aggression, aggression, I echoed. As if in response, my mother's body suddenly arched on the table, her mouth opening in a snarl that revealed teeth I'd never seen her bare in life. The moan became a guttural growl as she strained against the restraints I hadn't noticed until now. I stumbled back, colliding with the wall. "That's not my mother," I gasped. "No," Mr. Patterson agreed grimly. "Not anymore." In the days that followed, similar cases appeared across the country. The CDC issued increasingly alarming bulletins. First, they advised funeral homes to implement enhanced safety protocols, then hospitals, then the general public. The disease, officially named necrolocomotive encephalopathy, but quickly dubbed the zombie virus by the media, spread with terrifying efficiency. Those infected in life showed few symptoms until death, when the prion proteins activated, reanimating basic motor functions while erasing higher brain activity. The reanimated became aggressive, attacking the living with singular purpose, spreading the infection through bites and bodily fluids. Society unraveled with surprising speed. Major cities fell first, their dense populations ideal breeding grounds for the infection. The government established safe zones in rural areas, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Within weeks, traditional news broadcasts ceased. Information came instead through emergency radio frequencies, each update more dire than the last. I fled the city with a small group of survivors, taking refuge in an abandoned hunting cabin in the mountain. We rationed supplies, took turns standing watch, and tried to ignore the distant sounds of screaming that sometimes carried on the wind. One night, during my watch, I heard a rustle in the underbrush surrounding our cabin. I raised my rifle, finger tensing on the trigger, when a familiar figure emerged from the darkness. My mother. Her blue dress was tattered and soil-stained, her skin mottled with decomposition. Her movements were jerky, uncoordinated, but purposeful as she shambled toward the cabin. Toward me. I knew it wasn't really her. The disease had simply animated her corpse, driven by base instinct to feed and infect. The consciousness that had been my mother was long gone. Still, my hands shook as I lined up her milky eyes seemed to find mine, and for a moment I could almost believe some small part of her remained, trapped in that decaying shell. "I'm sorry, Mom," I whispered, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the mountains, likely attracting more of them. We'd have to move again, find another temporary haven in a world that now belonged to the dead. But as I watched my mother's body finally, truly lifeless, crumple to the ground, I felt a weight lift. I'd given her the peace that death had promised but failed to deliver. I never thought I'd be the one to kill my mother twice. But in this new world, the greatest act of love is sometimes a bullet. 6 months after what people now call the collapse, I've learned that survival isn't just about avoiding the infect. It's about preserving your humanity when everything around you has lost theirs. Our group has grown to 15 people. Strangers united by circumstance and the simple desire to wake up tomorrow. We've developed a routine of sorts. Scavenging runs during daylight hours when the infected are sluggish. Nights spent behind reinforced walls, speaking in whispers and praying the dead pass us by. We've learned things about them. They don't run, their decaying muscles and tendons won't allow for it. But they never tire. They don't think. but they remember. Traces of who they were sometimes surface in unexpected ways. A postal worker will follow his old route. A mother will cradle an empty space where a baby should be. The woman who joined our group last week, Rachel, a former nurse, told us about the hospital where she worked when the outbreak began. How the terminal patients were the first to turn. How no one made the connection until it was too late. Death is the trigger, she explained as we huddled around a small fire. The disease lies dormant until the host dies. Then it reactivates the brain stem, basic motor functions, hunger. The frontal cortex stays dead, but the primitive brain runs on autopilot. But how do they find us? Asked Michael, a college student who'd been visiting his grandfather when the world ended. It's like they can smell us or something. Rachel nodded. Probably can. Their senses seem heightened, especially hearing and smell. They can detect the living from impressive distances. That explained why noise discipline was so crucial. Why perfume or cologne was now more dangerous than helpful. Why we bathed with unscented soap when we could find it, or not at all when we couldn't. We've developed other survival strategies too. We wear layers, even in warm weather, harder to bite through. We carry weapons that don't require ammunition, baseball bats, crowbars, machetes. We travel light and never stay in one place too long. But despite our precautions, we still lose people. Last month it was David, a former accountant who'd survived the initial outbreak by locking himself in the server room of his office building. He was on a scavenging run with me when we entered what we thought was an abandoned convenience store. We'd separated to cover more ground. His first mistake. When I heard the crash from the stockroom, I ran to find him surrounded by 3 infected who had been huddled in hibernation mode. They tore into him before I could react. I managed to put them down with my machete, but it was too late for David. The bites on his arms and neck guaranteed infection. You know what you have to do, he gasped, blood bubbling between his lips. I did. A bite was a death sentence, followed by reanimation, but I couldn't bring myself to end his life. Maybe you're immune, I suggested desperately. Maybe. No maybes, he interrupted. Don't let me become one of them, please. In the end, it was Rachel who did what needed to be done. A quick, merciful knife to the brainstem. We buried him behind the store, marking the grave with a pile of rocks. No name, no dates, just another casualty in an endless war. That night, I dreamed of my mother, not as she was at the end, both ends, but as she had been in life, laughing as she taught me to bake cookies, crying at my graduation, rolling her eyes at my terrible jokes. You're doing well, she told me in the dream, but you need to let go of who they were. See them for what they are now. I woke with tears on my cheeks and a hollow ache in my chest, but she was right. Sentimentality was a luxury we could no longer afford. The infected weren't our loved ones anymore. They were the enemy. That philosophy served me well until yesterday, when we encountered a group of infected while scavenging in a small suburban neighborhood. We'd been careless, making too much noise breaking into a garage we thought might contain supplies. The resulting commotion drew a dozen shambling figures from surrounding houses. We fought our way out, but in the chaos, I came face to face with a small infected, a child. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8, wearing unicorn pajamas and a plastic tiara tangled in her matted hair. One of her arms hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Her neck bore the unmistakable marks of teeth. Adult teeth. She'd been bitten by someone she trusted. She lurched toward me, small hands grasping, a guttural growl issuing from her throat. I raised my bat, then froze. I couldn't do it. Not to a child. Michael pulled me away just as her teeth snapped shut where my wrist had been. She's not a little girl anymore, he hissed, dispatching her with a quick blow to the head. Remember that, or next time you'll get someone killed. He was right, of course, but as we fled the neighborhood, The image of that little girl in her princess crown stayed with me. How many more children had suffered similar fates? How many parents had been forced to watch their children turn, or worse, been forced to end their suffering? The encounter left me shaken, questioning the point of survival in such a world. But then, as we returned to our temporary camp, an abandoned ranger station deep in the national forest, I saw something that rekindled my hope. Two of our group, a young couple who'd been high school sweethearts before the collapse, sat on the porch, fingers intertwined, watching the sunset. Despite everything, they'd found each other. Despite everything, they still found beauty in a simple sunset. Life goes on, even when surrounded by death. And maybe that's enough of a reason to keep fighting. Tonight, we received a transmission on our hand-cranked radio. A voice claiming to represent what remains of the government announced the establishment of a permanent safe zone in the mountains of Colorado. A place with walls, electricity, clean water. A place where people are rebuilding. We've decided to go. It's a long journey, fraught with danger. Across terrain now ruled by the dead. But for the first time since that phone call from the funeral home, I feel something like hope. Tomorrow we leave at dawn. I don't know if we'll make it. I don't know if the safe zone really exists, or if it's just another false promise in a world full of them. But I do know this: as long as we're breathing, we're more than just survivors. We're living, and in the end, that's the only real victory against death. I think my mother would be proud. The infection began with a cough. As the staff virologist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Infectious Diseases Laboratory, I'd seen my share of concerning symptoms, but Sarah Chen's persistent cough barely registered as noteworthy when she first mentioned it during our Monday morning briefing. "Sorry," she said, clearing her throat for the third time in as many minutes. "Must be allergies." I nodded sympathetically. Atlanta in spring was brutal for allergy sufferers. The air thick with pollen that coated cars and windowsills with a fine yellow dust. Half our team was sniffling and sneezing their way through April. "Take an antihistamine," I suggested, returning my attention to the slides detailing our latest research on an emerging hemorrhagic fever in West Africa. "If it doesn't clear up in a few days, see a doctor." It was standard advice, the kind colleagues exchange a dozen times a day without thought. I had no way of knowing those casual words would haunt me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. By Wednesday, Sarah looked terrible. Her normally immaculate appearance had deteriorated. Hair limp, eyes bloodshot, skin ashen. The cough had deepened, becoming wet and productive. She moved slowly, as though every joint ached. "You should go home," I told her, maintaining a professional distance despite my concern. Sarah was brilliant, one of our most promising young researchers, but we weren't particularly close. "No offense, but you look awful." "Thanks, Dr. Reynolds," she replied with a weak smile. "I feel awful, but I need to finish processing these samples before I can call it quits." I should have insisted. As her supervisor, I had the authority to send her home. Instead, I simply reminded her to wear her PPE and wash her hands frequently. Basic precautions that should have been sufficient for what we both assumed was a common cold or seasonal flu. By Friday, Sarah was absent. A brief email explained she'd finally seen a doctor, who diagnosed her with pneumonia and prescribed antibiotics and bed rest. I sent a quick, "get well soon" reply and promptly forgot about her as I dealt with the usual end-of-week bureaucratic emergency. It wasn't until the following Monday, when the director of our division called an emergency meeting, that Sarah Chen re-entered my thoughts. Director Patel stood at the head of the conference table, his normally unflappable demeanor visibly strained. "I've just received disturbing news," he began without preamble. "Dr. Chen was admitted to Emory University Hospital last night with severe respiratory distress. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, and she's currently in the ICU on a ventilator." Murmurs of concern rippled through the room. Pneumonia could be serious, but Sarah was young and healthy. The speed of her decline was alarming. "What's more concerning," Patel continued, "is that preliminary tests show she's not responding to antibiotic therapy. and her chest X-rays show an unusual presentation. The infectious disease team at Emory has concerns this may be a novel pathogen. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. We were experts in infectious diseases. We knew how quickly a situation could escalate from a single case to a full-blown outbreak. Given that Dr. Chen works directly with infectious agents in our lab, Patel said, we need to rule out any possibility of laboratory exposure. Dr. Reynolds, as her immediate supervisor, I'll need a complete inventory of everything she's worked with in the past month. Of course, I agreed, my mind already racing through the projects Sarah had been involved with. None involved pathogens that could explain her symptoms. The meeting concluded with instructions for enhanced safety protocols and a request that anyone exhibiting similar symptoms report to employee health immediately. As we filed out, Dr. Patel caught my arm. James, he said quietly, using my first name. Never a good sign. There's something else you should know. 2 nurses who treated Sarah in the ER yesterday are now showing similar symptoms. My blood ran cold. Person-to-person transmission changed everything. Over the next 72 hours, the situation deteriorated with frightening speed. Sarah Chen died at 2:47 a.m. on Wednesday, just 5 days after I'd last seen her. By then, 14 healthcare workers who'd been in contact with her were displaying symptoms: fever, cough, extreme fatigue, rapidly progressing to respiratory failure. The CDC deployed our Emergency Operations Center, activating the highest level of response. I led the team investigating the source of infection, working around the clock to identify the pathogen while other departments handled patient tracking and containment strategies. When we finally isolated the virus from Sarah's tissue samples, what we found defied explanation. It resembled a highly modified coronavirus, but with genetic sequences that appeared almost engineered, optimized for human-to-human transmission and swift replication within host cells. Could this be a bioweapon? Asked Dr. Eliza Washington, our senior microbiologist, voicing the question we'd all been avoiding. Let's not jump to conclusions, I cautioned, though the possibility had occurred to me too. Natural selection can produce some terrifying results all on its own. But as we dug deeper into Sarah's work history, uncomfortable questions emerged. 3 months earlier, she'd returned from a research conference in Hong Kong. Her agenda showed meetings with virologists from several countries, including some known to have advanced bioweapons program. When I reported this to Director Patel, he immediately involved federal agencies. Within hours, men and women in dark suits filled our offices, conducting interviews and seizing files. National security had taken precedence over public health. Meanwhile, the virus continued its relentless spread. What began in one Atlanta hospital quickly jumped to others as infected healthcare workers unknowingly carried it home, to other medical facilities, to grocery stores and schools before becoming symptomatic. The first public acknowledgement came 9 days after Sarah's death. A joint CDC-WHO announcement of a respiratory illness of concern, circulating in the southeastern United States. By then, cases had already appeared in 12 states and 4 countries. They named it Severe Acute Pulmonary Syndrome, SAPS in the sterile language of epidemiology. But medical terminology did little to convey the horror of the disease's progression. SAPS began like many respiratory infections: fever, cough, fatigue. But by day 4 or 5, patients experienced a rapid decline, developing what we called the cascade: multi-organ inflammation, neurological symptoms, and eventually complete respiratory failure. Death typically followed within 48 hours of intubation, though some patients lingered longer, sustained by ventilators while their bodies essentially dissolved from within. The mortality rate hovered around 60%, catastrophic by any standard. But that wasn't what transformed SAPS from a severe epidemic into the collapse of human civilization as we knew it. It was what happened after death. The first incident occurred at Atlanta Memorial Hospital. 20 days into the outbreak, an orderly working the night shift in the morgue reported that a deceased patient, a 42-year-old male who had been pronounced dead 6 hours earlier, suddenly sat up on the examination table, The report was initially dismissed as a macabre joke or a case of premature death certification, until it happened again and again in hospital morgues across the country. Patients' victims were reanimating hours after clinical death. These weren't miraculous recoveries. The reanimated exhibited no higher brain function, no capacity for speech, no recognition of their surroundings or former identities. They were driven by one imperative: to attack and bite the living, and those bitten invariably developed pace, died, and reanimated themselves. The scientific community struggled to explain the phenomenon. The leading theory proposed that the virus hijacked the brainstem post-mortem, reactivating basic motor functions, while the higher brain remained necrotic. The aggression and biting behavior served the virus's evolutionary imperative: transmission to new hosts. Whatever the mechanism, the result was the same. We were no longer fighting merely an epidemic. We were fighting the living dead. Civilization unraveled with astonishing speed. Healthcare systems collapsed first, overwhelmed by the dual crisis of treating the infected and containing the reanimated. Quarantine zones were established in major cities, but they quickly proved ineffective against both the airborne primary transmission and the secondary vector of the reanimated. Military forces deployed to maintain order found themselves fighting a losing battle against an enemy that couldn't be deterred, reasoned with, or terrified into submission. An enemy that grew stronger with each fallen soldier. 46 days after Sarah Chen first coughed in our morning briefing, the president addressed what remained of the nation from a bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. His message was grim. The federal government no longer controlled most major population centers. Citizens were advised to evacuate urban areas, avoid contact with the infected and reanimated, and wait for further instructions that we all knew would never come. By then, I had abandoned Atlanta with a small group of CDC colleagues. We established a makeshift research facility in a decommissioned military bunker in rural Georgia, continuing our work by generator power and sheer determination. If the virus had a weakness, we were determined to find it. Months passed with little progress. Our supplies dwindled. Our communication with other research facilities became increasingly sporadic, until eventually, we were alone. A scientific outpost in a world returned to a dark age. One by one, my colleagues succumbed, not to pace, which we had managed to avoid through strict isolation protocols, but to despair. Suicide claimed more of our team than disease ever did. By the one-year anniversary of what we now called simply the fall, only 3 of us remained: myself, Washington, and Dr. Patel. And then finally a breakthrough. Not a cure, it was far too late for that. But understand, using tissue samples from the reanimated, we identified the mechanism by which the virus persisted after death, maintaining just enough neural activity to power basic locomotion and predatory behavior. It's elegant, in a horrifying way, Eliza observed as we reviewed the data. The virus essentially turns humans into its puppets, perfect vectors for transmission. But why the aggression? Patel wondered. Why do they attack the living so relentlessly? I had a theory about that. The virus needs fresh tissue to replicate effectively. As the host decays, it becomes less viable as a reservoir. Biting behavior ensures transmission to new hosts before the current one deteriorates completely. It was cold comfort. This knowledge, scientific curiosity satisfied while the world burned, but it gave us purpose when little else remained. That purpose died with Eliza and Patel. They ventured out on a supply run 3 months ago and never returned. I waited 2 weeks before accepting they weren't coming back. Now I'm truly alone, the last scientist in a dead world, recording these findings in the desperate hope that someday someone will find them useful. My supplies will last another month, perhaps 2 if I'm careful. After that, I'll need to venture outside. The thought fills me with dread. From our perimeter cameras I can see them, dozens of reanimated, drawn by some instinct to the heat or sound or scent of the living. They gather at the fence line, waiting with the infinite patience of the dead. Among them I sometimes glimpse a figure in the tattered remains of a lab coat. From this distance I can't be certain, but I believe it's Sarah Chen, patient 0. The beginning of the end. I often wonder if I could have prevented this. If I'd sent her home that Wednesday when she looked so ill. If I'd investigated her work more carefully. If I'd raised the alarm sooner. But such thoughts are exercises in futility. The virus was engineered for this exact purpose. To spread rapidly, kill efficiently, and create a self-perpetuating cycle of infection. Whether it escaped a laboratory accidentally or was released deliberately hardly matters now. What matters is what I do with my remaining time. Do I continue my research, hoping for a miracle breakthrough? Do I try to reach other survivors if any exist? Or do I use my last bullet on myself, denying the virus its final victory in this bunker? For now I choose research, knowledge, hope however faint. I owe it to Sarah Chen, whose fatal cough set this apocalypse in motion. I owe it to my colleagues who died still fighting. I owe it to whatever remains of humanity. And if you're reading this, it means something of humanity does remain. Remember us. Remember what we lost. Remember that it began with a cough and ended with the world. This is Dr. James Reynolds, former staff virologist at the CDC, signing off. May God have mercy on us all. The first sign that something was wrong in Oak Ridge Estates was the Pattersons' lawn. Roger Patterson was notorious for his meticulous yard maintenance. His grass never exceeded 2 inches. His hedges were trimmed with such precision you could set your watch by their edges. His seasonal flower beds were the envy of our suburban development, bursting with carefully coordinated blooms that his wife Diane would proudly display at the county fair. So when I noticed on my morning jog that their lawn had grown shaggy and unkempt, littered with 3 days' worth of newspapers, I knew something was off. Maybe they're on vacation, suggested my wife Hannah when I mentioned it over breakfast. I shook my head, buttering my toast. Roger would never leave without arranging for lawn service. Remember last year when they went to Aruba? He had that service from the city come every 4 days, left a binder of instructions for Fim. Hannah smiled. Not everyone is as obsessed with their neighbors as you are, David. She had a point. Since losing my job 6 months earlier, I'd become the unofficial neighborhood watchdog. From my home office window, I observed the comings and goings of Oak Ridge Estates with perhaps too much interest. It was better than dwelling on my unemployment, the increasingly tense emails from recruiters, the dwindling balance in our savings account. I'll drop by later, I decided. Make sure everything's okay. But before I could, Miss Abernathy from across the street came power walking up our driveway as I collected the mail. The neighborhood gossip had never needed an invitation to share information. "Have you seen the Pattersons?" she asked without preamble, her voice pitched low as though sharing state secret. Diane was supposed to bring her casserole dish to book club Tuesday. Never showed, never called. I was just noticing their lawn, I admitted. Not like them. Called their cells. Straight to voicemail. Mrs. Abernathy leaned closer. And there's something else. Last night, around midnight, I saw Roger in their backyard, just standing there, staring at their pool, for hours, didn't move even when it started raining. A chill ran up my spine despite the warm May sunshine. That's odd. Their car's in the driveway, curtains drawn. I knocked yesterday morning and could have sworn I heard someone inside, but nobody answered. She straightened her tracksuit. I'm thinking of calling the police. Wellness check. Let me try first, I offered, not wanting to escalate unnecessarily. They might just be sick or something. Mrs. Abernathy nodded, clearly disappointed to have the potential drama delayed. Let me know what you find out. And David, her expression grew serious. Be careful. There's been reports of some nasty flu going around, the kind that lands people in the hospital. I'd heard rumors, an aggressive strain resistant to the year's vaccine. The local news had mentioned increased hospital admissions, but nothing that seemed cause for alarm. Still, I promised to keep my distance if the Pattersons were indeed ill. After lunch, I walked the short distance to their colonial-style house at the end of our cul-de-sac. Up close, the signs of neglect were even more apparent. Unread newspapers formed a soggy pile near the driveway. A package sat on the front porch, its delivery notification flapping in the breeze. The usual symphony of birds visiting Roger's elaborate feeder system had been replaced by an eerie silence. The feeders empty, the birds gone. I rang the doorbell, listening to its cheerful chime echo through the house. No response. Knocked firmly. Nothing. Just as I was about to leave, I heard a thud from inside, something heavy falling or being knocked over. Then shuffling footsteps approaching the door. Roger, Diane, it's David from down the street. Just checking in to see if everything's okay. The footsteps stopped directly on the other side of the door. No response, but I could hear breathing, labored, wet, ragged. The peephole darkened as someone looked out. "Hello? Do you need anything? Groceries or medication?" A sound came then. Not words exactly, but a moan so guttural and distressed, it raised goosebumps on my arms. Then more thuds as though someone was banging against the door itself. "I'm going to call for help," I said, backing away. "Hang tight." As I retreated down the walkway, the front curtain twitched. Through the gap, I caught a glimpse of Diane Patterson's face, or what used to be her face. Her skin was gray. Her eyes clouded, and dark fluid stained her chin and the front of her usually immaculate blouse. I called 911 as soon as I was back home, reporting what I'd seen and requesting a wellness check. The dispatcher seemed harried, mentioning they'd had numerous similar calls that day. An officer would respond when available. No one came that day, or the next. By then, the Pattersons weren't the only concern in Oak Ridge Estates. The Brubakers at number 17 hadn't been seen since the weekend. The Gardner twins hadn't boarded their school bus for 3 consecutive mornings. Mr. Collins, who walked his corgi religiously at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., was conspicuously absent from his route. And there were the nighttime wanderers, residents whom I recognized despite their shambling gaits and vacant expressions, appearing in yards or streets after dark, standing motionless for hours, watching, waiting. Social media buzzed with reports of a severe epidemic overwhelming hospitals in major cities. Local news stations broadcasted increasingly urgent advisories about an infectious agent spreading rapidly through the region. Instructions to stay home, avoid contact with symptomatic individuals, and wait for further guidance. The CDC website crashed under the traffic. When it returned, its front page featured stark red warning banners and terms like unprecedented mortality rates and containment protocols. Hannah wanted to leave town, visit her parents in Vermont, where cases seemed fewer. I argued for staying put, following official advice to shelter in place. Our argument was interrupted by a series of gunshots from down the street, sharp cracks that echoed through the development, followed by screams. We locked our doors, closed our blinds, tried calling 911 again but got only busy signals. That night, the power went out. In the sudden darkness, the silence of our once bustling neighborhood became oppressive. Hannah and I huddled in our bedroom, listening to the emergency radio I dug out of the garage. The broadcasts were sporadic, increasingly desperate. Reports of hospitals overrun, civil unrest, military deployments to major population centers. Then, around 3 a.m., a new broadcast cut through the static. A military spokesman announcing containment protocols for our county. The message was clear beneath the bureaucratic language. No one in, no one out. We were on our own. We need to check our supplies, Hannah whispered, her face pale in the beam of our flashlight. See how long we can last. The inventory was sobering. 3 gallons of water, canned goods to last maybe 2 weeks if we rationed carefully. half a bottle of Tylenol, Hannah's prescription medications for another month, 2 flashlights, and a dwindling pack of batteries. Not enough if this situation dragged on, not nearly enough. Dawn brought no relief. From our second-floor window, I surveyed Oak Ridge Estates in the gray morning light. Several front doors stood wide open, as if the occupants had fled or been dragged in haste. A car had crashed into the Hendersons' mailbox, its driver's door ajar, engine still running despite what must have been hours of idling. And there were figures in the street. Neighbors I recognized. Mrs. Abernathy in her tracksuit, now torn and stained dark. The teenage Wilson boy who mowed lawns in summer, his signature baseball cap askew on his motionless head, as he stood in the middle of the cul-de-sac swaying slightly. Mr. Gardner, dressed in what appeared to be pajamas, repeatedly walking into the side of his own garage as if he'd forgotten how doors worked. They moved wrong. Jerky, uncoordinated movements. Some dragged feet or limbs at unnatural angle, and they were silent. No calls for help, no conversation among those standing near each other. Just eerie, watchful stillness punctuated by bursts of shambling movement. "David," Hannah called softly from behind me. "The Pattersons are in our backyard." I rushed to the rear window. Roger and Diane stood side by side on our patio, heads tilted back to stare directly at our bedroom window. Diane's once meticulously styled hair hung in matted clumps around her gray face. Roger's right arm dangled at an impossible angle, clearly broken. Both were covered in dark stains I didn't want to identify. As we watched, frozen in horror, more figures emerged from the wooded area behind our property line. The Brubakers, the Collins family, even their corgi now moving with the same wrong gait as its owners. The Gardner twins, matching bloodstains on their private school uniform, all staring at our house, all moving with slow but inexorable purpose toward our back door. "They know we're here," Hannah whispered. "How do they know we're here?" I had no answer, but as I watched Roger Patterson lift his unbroken arm to press against our patio door, I knew with certainty that these were no longer our neighbors, not really. Whatever illness had swept through Oak Ridge Estates hadn't just killed its victims, it had transformed them. The radio had used clinical terms: post-mortem neurological activity, aggressive behavior in terminal cases, carefully worded warnings to avoid physical contact with symptomatic individuals, especially bites or exposure to bodily fluids. They hadn't used the word, that ridiculous, impossible word from horror movies and comic books, but I knew what we were facing, even if I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. The dead were walking, and they were hungry. We held out for 2 weeks in our house, 2 weeks of dwindling supplies and increasing terror as more of our neighbors joined the silent vigil around our property. 2 weeks of watching military helicopters pass overhead without stopping, of hearing distant explosions and gunfire from the direction of the city, of scanning emergency broadcasts that grew less frequent by the day. The power never returned. Water pressure dropped to a trickle before failing completely. Cell service existed only in brief, unpredictable windows, enough to exchange desperate texts with similarly trapped friends and family across the country before the signal disappeared again. We learned bits and pieces about what was happening. The disease, officially designated novel necrotizing encephalopathy, but quickly dubbed the zombie virus in what remained of social media, had appeared simultaneously in major cities across the globe. Theories abounded: biological warfare, a mutated prion disease, divine punishment. The truth hardly mattered to those fighting to survive. What mattered were the facts on the ground. The infected died within days of exposure, within hours of death. They reanimated with no higher brain function but an insatiable drive to attack the living. Bites and fluid contact spread the infection with near 100% efficiency. Conventional weapons worked against them, but only with catastrophic damage to the brain stem. They didn't sleep, didn't tire, didn't stop. And they were learning, or adapting. Somehow, the first wave had been mindless, attacking with animalistic frenzy. But those gathered around our house displayed something closer to patience, strategy. They maintained their perimeter, waiting for us to make a mistake or for desperation to drive us outside. On the 15th day, we faced the inevitable. We needed supplies. Our water was gone, food down to a few cans of mixed vegetables and a stale box of crackers. Hannah's medication would run out in another week. "I'll go," I said, checking the baseball bat I'd chosen as a weapon. A gun would have been better, but we didn't own one. The Walgreens on Maple is only a mile away. I can be there and back in an hour if the road is clear. Hannah shook her head. "We go together or not at all. We've seen the broadcasts. No one survives alone out there." She was right, of course. The few emergency bulletins still coming through emphasized group survival buddy systems, the fatal consequences of isolation. But the thought of exposing her to what waited outside our door made my stomach turn. "Besides," she added with grim humor, "who else is going to watch your back? You can't even load the dishwasher properly." We prepared as best we could with limited resources, multiple layers of clothing, despite the summer heat, harder to bite through. Backpacks for supplies, makeshift weapons, my bat, a kitchen knife for Hannah, garden shears, a hammer. We studied the pattern of our undead neighbors through the window. They clustered more densely at the front of the house, perhaps drawn by the more frequent signs of our presence there. The back offered thinner coverage, a potential escape route through the woods behind our property. We chose dawn for our attack. The broadcasts had mentioned the infected were somewhat slower, less responsive in early morning hours. Whether true or propaganda designed to offer false hope, it was the only tactical advantage we had. Our plan was simple: out the back door, through the woods to the service road that ran behind the development, then overland to avoid the likely congested main streets. The Walgreens, a quick grab of essentials, and the same route in reverse. What actually happened was chaos. The moment we opened the back door, the nearest infected, Mr. Collins, still in the tattered remains of a business suit, turned toward the sound with unnatural speed. His moan alerted the others, a guttural call that raised the hair on my arm. Within seconds, our carefully observed pattern collapsed, as every walking corpse in the vicinity oriented toward us and began to advance. Hannah gripped my hand. "Run. Now." We bolted across the yard toward the tree line, the infected lurching into pursuit with unexpected speed. I felt fingers grasp at my jacket. Mrs. Abernathy, her once friendly face now a mask of gray flesh and exposed teeth, and swung the bat instinctively. The impact shattered her jaw, but she kept coming, kept reaching. It wasn't until a second blow caved in the side of her head that she finally collapsed. Hannah screamed. I turned to see Roger Patterson with his good arm wrapped around her backpack, pulling her toward his snapping teeth. She stabbed backward with her knife, catching him in the shoulder, a blow that would have incapacitated the living Roger with pain, but merely annoyed his reanimated corpse. I swung the bat with every ounce of strength I possessed, connecting solidly with his temple. He dropped like a stone, taking Hannah down with him. I yanked her free, and we ran, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. The woods offered temporary salvation. The infected moved clumsily among the trees, their deteriorating motor skills no match for the uneven terrain. We gained ground, reaching the service road breathless, but unbitten. We should have turned back then. Should have recognized that the universe was giving us one chance to return to our fortress and find another solution. Instead, propelled by desperation and the false confidence of our narrow escape, we continued toward Walgreens. The main roads were as bad as we'd feared. Abandoned cars created a maze of metal and glass. Bodies, both the permanently dead and the temporarily deceased, who would soon rise again, sprawled across asphalt and sidewalks. In the distance, pillars of smoke rose from burning buildings. The suburban landscape we'd known had transformed into a war zone in just 2 weeks. We moved cautiously, ducking between vehicles, freezing at every sound. Twice we diverted our route to avoid groups of infected. Once we hid beneath an overturned SUV as a pack of them shuffled past, close enough that I could smell the sweet, sick odor of decay emanating from their body. The Walgreens, when we finally reached it, had clearly been looted. The front windows were shattered, shelves toppled, merchandise scattered across the floor. But looters are often hasty, taking only the obvious. We found a cache of bottled water hidden behind a fallen display, canned goods overlooked in the storeroom, a forgotten box of Hannah's medication knocked beneath a pharmacy counter. Not everything we needed, but enough to justify the risk, enough to buy us another few weeks of survival. The return journey began well. The adrenaline of success made us move faster, more confidently. We were halfway home when we heard the screaming. A young woman ran from between 2 houses, a small child clutched in her arms. Behind her came 3 infected, moving with the eerily single-minded purpose of predators who sensed vulnerable prey. The woman was fast, but the weight of the child slowed her. It was clear she wouldn't outrun them for long. Hannah gripped my arm. We have to help them. Every survival instinct screamed against it. We were outnumbered, minimally armed, already burdened with supplies. The smart move, the selfish move, was to slip away, to save ourselves. But what kind of life would that be? What kind of world were we trying to survive in, if we abandoned a mother and child to death? I handed Hannah the backpack with our hard-won supplies. Get to that blue house. Lock yourself in. I'll bring them to you. Before she could protest, I stepped into the street, swinging my bat against a metal mailbox to create a resounding clang. Hey, over here. The infected hesitated, momentarily torn between their current chase and this new, noisy target. I struck the mailbox again. Come on, you rotting bastards. Fresh meat over here. 2 of them turned toward me. The third continued its pursuit of the woman. Good enough odds. I braced myself as the pair shambled in my direction, mentally calculating angles and timing. Tackle one, outrun the other, circle back for the third. Get the woman and child to safety. Find Hannah. Get home. Simple. Except nothing is simple in a world gone mad. I took down the first infected with a solid blow to the head, pivoted to face the second. Didn't see the half-eaten corpse lying in the nearby bushes, one that chose that exact moment to reanimate and grab my ankle. I went down hard, the bat spinning from my grasp. The standing infected lurched closer. The one gripping my leg pulled itself upward, mouth opening with hungry purpose. In desperate panic, I kicked repeatedly at its face until its grip loosened, then scrambled backward on hands and heels like a crab. My hand closed around something solid, a chunk of concrete from a shattered garden border. I smashed it into the crawler's skull, then rolled aside as the standing infected lunged. Back on my feet, I retrieved my bat and finished it with 2 solid swings. By the time I dispatched both threats, the woman and child had vanished, fled in another direction, while the remaining infected continued its single-minded pursuit. Hannah emerged from her hiding place, ashen-faced but unharmed. I saw them run into that yellow house, she said, pointing down the block. Should we? A piercing scream cut through the air, followed by a sound I've come to recognize as uniquely horrific, the wet, tearing noise of teeth meeting flesh. Then a child's cry abruptly silenced. We were too late. Hannah began to sob, the sound dangerously loud in the open street. I pulled her close, as much to muffle her cries as to offer comfort. We have to go. Now. more will come. The journey home was a blur of tension and sorrow. Every shadow concealed potential death. Every sound froze us in our tracks. But somehow, incredibly, we made it back to our house, sealing ourselves inside our increasingly fragile sanctuary. That night, as Hannah finally slept, exhausted from grief and exertion, I sat watch at the window. The infected had returned to their vigil around our property, perhaps drawn by our scent trail leading back from our expedition. Among them now was a new figure, small, child-sized, moving with the same wrong gait as the adults. I turned away, stomach churning. We had risked everything to help, and failed. Was survival even worth it in a world this broken? What kind of future awaited us if we managed to outlast this nightmare? Morning brought no answers, but it did bring something unexpected. A military convoy, rolling slowly down our street. 3 armored vehicles, soldiers in full hazmat gear, sweeping methodically from house to house. Through binoculars, I could see them dispatching the infected with practiced efficiency. Single shots to the brain from specialized firearms. Hannah wept with relief when I told her. They've come, they're finally helping. I wasn't so sure. The methodical nature of the operation, the lack of attempts to contact survivors before entering homes, sent warning signals through my brain. This didn't feel like rescue. It felt like cleanup. When they reached the Pattersons' house 2 doors down, my suspicions were confirmed. A soldier emerged briefly to make a radio call I couldn't hear. Minutes later, the house erupted in flames, deliberately set from within. They're burning everything, I whispered, horrified. They're not saving the neighborhood. They're sanitizing it. Hannah joined me at the window, her hope crumbling as she watched another house ignite. But what about survivors? They can't just... I think that's exactly what they're doing. I cut in, mind racing. Think about it. The disease spreads too easily. A single overlooked case could restart everything. From their perspective, it's safer to assume everyone in an infected zone is compromised. As if to confirm my theory, a soldier with a bullhorn appeared atop one of the vehicles. His amplified voice echoed through the empty street. This area is under Class 5 quarantine by order of the Emergency Response Authority. All structures will be neutralized. Any survivors are directed to display white flags and await processing. Such a clinical term for whatever awaited those who surrendered. Hannah clutched my arm. What do we do? If we stay, we burn. If we surrender, the unfinished thought hung between us. In the 2 weeks since the outbreak began, we'd seen enough government responses to be rightfully skeptical. Quarantine camps where the infected were herded together, accelerating transmission, temporary relocation centers that became permanent, reports of experimentation on those showing immunity, rumors of summary executions for anyone exposed, whether symptomatic or not. We run, I decided, already gathering our emergency bags. Out the back, through the woods, away from the sweep line. There are other survivors out there, communities organizing. We've heard them on the radio. Hannah nodded, her teacher's practicality asserting itself through the fear. The national forest. If we can reach it, we can disappear until this passes. If it passes, I thought but didn't say. Some rational part of me understood this might be the new normal. Pockets of humanity hiding from both the dead who hungered for their flesh, and the living who would sacrifice them for the greater good. We were ready in minutes. A skill born of 2 weeks spent in constant preparation for the moment our sanctuary failed. Through the back door again. But this time the infected in our yard were distracted by the commotion of the military operation, drawn to the lights and sounds of their next potential meal. We slipped into the woods unnoticed, the smoke from our burning neighborhood providing cover as we put distance between ourselves and everything we had once known. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, the constant threat of the walking dead. Behind us lay the ashes of suburbia, the death of the world we had taken for granted. That was 6 months ago. We found others along the way, survivors like us, distrustful of authority, skilled enough or lucky enough to evade both the infected and the increasingly draconian sweep operation. Our group now numbers 17, living in a network of cabins deep in the national forest, far from established roads and trails. We've learned much about our undead neighbors. They're slower in cold weather. Their deteriorating bodies eventually fail, usually within 6 to 8 months of turning. They're attracted to sound but can't distinguish directional sources well, a fact we exploit regularly with distraction techniques. Most importantly, they're not evolving or learning as we initially feared. Their seeming strategy was merely coincidence or primitive instinct. Reports on our salvaged radio suggest the military has established green zones in remote areas, truly safe havens where society is beginning to rebuild. Some in our group want to seek them out. Others, like Hannah and me, remain skeptical. We've created something here, not just survival but a community, a fragile new beginning. Sometimes at night I still dream of Oak Ridge Estates, of Roger Patterson's immaculate lawn and Mrs. Abernathy's gossipy smile, of Sunday barbecues and neighborhood watch meetings, and the blissful ignorance of ordinary life. But every morning I wake to our new reality, to the necessity of perimeter checks and hunting parties, and the constant vigilance that keeps us alive. To Hannah's face, thinner now but somehow stronger, as she coordinates our small school for the children in our group. This morning she told me she's pregnant, 3 months along, a miracle amidst devastation. The others celebrated when we shared the news, breaking out precious reserves of canned fruit and honey for an impromptu party. Even in this broken world, life continues. Hope persists. Tonight, as I take my shift on watch, scanning the dark forest for the shambling silhouettes of the dead, I find myself wondering what kind of world our child will inherit. Will they know only this life of constant danger and scarcity? Or will humanity reclaim what was lost, rebuild from the ashes of civilization? I don't have answers, but as I watch the stars emerge above the trees, brighter now without light pollution obscuring their ancient fire, I make a silent promise to our unborn child. This world of the dead is not the end of our story. It's merely a dark chapter in a longer tale, and I will do whatever it takes to ensure they live to see the next chapter begin. After all, what are neighbors for, if not looking out for each other?